Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, with 4 African countries at the bottom of the ranking of progress towards key global sustainable development indicators, I speak to South Africa's International Affairs Minister about her hopes for a crucial Paris summit aimed at ushering in a new financial world order. Also, at least one person dies as violence breaks out around Sierra Leone's main opposition party headquarters, just days away from electing its next president. And despite being a major cocoa and gold exporter, Ghana is currently battling its worst financial crisis in years, with inflation topping 40%. We take a closer look. But first, the world is failing across the board to meet its 2030 sustainability goals. And the gap between wealthy and developing nations is just getting wider. From poverty to clean energy to biodiversity, not a single one of the targets agreed by UN member states in 2015 is on track halfway through the timeframe. The report on progress towards these Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, ranked 4 African countries amongst the bottom 5 of all nations assessed, with South Sudan right at the bottom. The authors warn that changing global governance and finance is key if the world is to ride out collective life or death threats like climate change. Those questions are at the heart of a crucial global finance summit kicking off here in Paris on Thursday. On its eve, I caught up with South Africa's International Relations Minister and asked her why so many believe that there is a need for a new world order.
Well, I think that the focus on development has altered considerably in the last 5 years, and more particularly in the past 2 years of this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Much more attention is being paid by the North to Ukraine and support for it, rather than the conflicts on the African continent or issues of development on the African continent. We've even seen a decline in aid support. There's very little mention of very terrible conflicts on the African continent, and inadequate attention to the Sustainable Development Goals, which were and are the global agenda for development.
So you think that the changes that have come about relatively in the short term, do you think that that can be shifted away from?
Well, I don't think it's merely been over the short term. I think there have been several years of not really honoring commitments. I mean, for example, one of the topics that will be focused upon in the summit is the issue of climate change and how support is provided for mitigation. Over a number of conferences of the parties, there have been commitments for funding and technology transfer. Very few of these commitments have been realized, even in terms of the promised financing, which is so necessary for countries, especially developing countries, to respond to the effects of climate change and make the necessary productive adjustments that reduce harmful emissions and modernize countries so that they're greener and cleaner. So it's been several years of neglect and inadequate attention to really working in partnership to advance global development goals. The most stark evidence of this was seen with the vaccine response on COVID-19, where developing countries, and particularly Africa, were at the back of the queue, and developed countries hoarded vaccines, which up to today have not been fully utilized.
How will you make sure that there is an alignment between what happens here in Paris and what's come before?
I think that's the responsibility of leaders, of the participants. What I'm pleased about with respect to the summit is that the various institutions are being drawn together. So, sometimes a summit of this nature is called, United Nations is absent, or the World Bank or the IMF. But at this summit, all of these institutions are party to the deliberations. And then how do we ensure, with respect to multilateral finance institutions, that developing countries have a real voice, that the quota that they have as part of these institutions matters and has an impact on their progress? So I would like to see, rather than a new set of debates and just a sort of talk shop, an increased attention to a coherent, coordinated set of proposals that must then be packaged by the premier multilateral institution, which we all belong to, which is the United Nations. What summits must avoid is becoming talk shops, which cause us to be wary and weary of, these constant conferences where wonderful conclusions are spoken of, beautiful, very long declarations, and yet 3 years down the line, when you look back, you actually haven't made any progress. So I'm hoping that now the urgency of making progress on development will influence concrete planning, concrete strategy, and real outcomes.
Naledi Pandor, the South Africa's International Relations Minister, speaking to me a little earlier on. Well, in other news, days after South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa led a visit of other leaders from the continent on a peace mission to Ukraine and Russia, the Kremlin has announced that a Russia-Africa summit due in July will run for 2 days rather than 4. The meeting, the second of its kind, had originally been meant to run from the 26th to the 29th, but now will be held from the 27th and 28th of July. One of the 30 people in custody in connection to the deaths of hundreds in Kenya who were part of a doomsday cult has died in police custody. Joseph Buyuka died after a 10-day hunger strike. At least 337 members of the Good News International Church, run by Pastor Paul Mackenzie, died after being encouraged to starve to death to reach heaven before the end of the world. Now, at least one person has died as violence broke out around Sierra Leone's main opposition party headquarters on Wednesday. The country is just days away from electing its next president. Opposition supporters had rallied in Freetown to call for the head of the Electoral Commission to resign. Laurent Stacker tells us more.
Equipped with AK-47s, flashball cannons, and even sniper rifles, heavily armed security forces cracked down on an opposition rally in Freetown. Days before heading to the polls, dozens of protesters had been calling for the head of Sierra Leone's Electoral Commission to step down.
We are here to protest because we want a credible elections. All we are asking for, we don't have problem with the government of the day. We just want a credible elections.
Last week, opposition leader Samura Kamara questioned the impartiality of the commission and called for it to be replaced by an independent international body ahead of Saturday's vote. But the accusations were rejected by the head of the commission and by Sierra Leone's president, Julius Maada Bio, who's running for a second term. On Tuesday, he called for a peaceful vote and said he wouldn't tolerate any form of violence.
I want to appeal to everybody. We want peaceful election, no violence. You have your card on that day, go and vote.
Seen as the frontrunner, Bio has been hailed for his progressive policies, including boosting access to education and women's representation in politics. But critics have denounced shrinking civic liberties under his rule and an excessive use of force to silence protests.
Well, Ghana is battling its worst economic crisis in decades. The World Bank had once hailed it as a West African shining star, and by 2019 it had the world's fastest growing economy. But with inflation topping 40%, that is far from the case today. Our correspondent tells us more.
Ghana's economic crisis is hitting the country's poorest hard. Inflation is now at 42%, more than 4 times what it was only 2 years ago. Like many, Esther is feeling the pinch.
I would spend maybe 250 cedis on transport a month. Then after things started increasing, transport fares and stuff, I would now spend maybe like 400, 450. So that actually made me move because rent is almost like the same price.
She has recently been forced to leave her parents' home for a rented house close to her job, as her travel expenses have doubled in less than 2 years. Ghana has defaulted on some of its foreign debt. It has deferred some repayment as part of a set of conditions to secure a $3 billion bailout from the International Monetary Fund. It is the country's second bailout request in less than 10 years. But there are fundamental challenges with the country's economy that need fixing.
Our economy is very import dependent. It's affected things like transport, the fuel transport, so that the cutting and the availability of food. It has affected our food security in various ways.
The government has given assurances it is working to bring inflation down and to stabilize the cedi, Ghana's currency. Yet, many remain unconvinced.
As a young person, you can't save for anything in this world. Like, you take your salary, it's never enough. Sometimes you have to go and borrow to support yourself throughout the month. It's terrible. And it's as if it wouldn't even change. That's how we look at it. Because prices go up, they never come down. We are in Ghana. We all know this. It just keeps going up. And it's not like anybody is going to do anything about it.
With the country going to the polls next year and a history of government over-expenditure in previous election years, many analysts fear the country may slip back despite the fresh air brought about by this new IMF deal.
That report there by Justice Baidu. Well, that's it for Eye on Africa. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Till then, take care.